related to that, and I thank the gentleman for bringing it up. We now go to the distinguished and patient gentleman from Utah for 5 minutes, Mr. Matheson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing, and thank you. I'm not a member of this committee, and I appreciate your allowing me to sit in and participate in today's.
Well, you may tell your friends, this is a committee that represents all jurisdictions of all parts of the Congress, so we would be loath not to include people from the other distinguished committees that we often ask the same questions on the same subjects with.
I certainly appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, ranking member. And I appreciate the witnesses being here today. We've heard a lot about the 1 in 88 number. I come from a state where it's 1 in 47. And I've heard a couple of other members ask questions about differences in incident in different regions. And I'm one that represents a state that's sort of at the one end of the scale, from Utah. And I've heard a lot about this from my constituents. And I've always been an advocate for responsible funding and research for NIH to try to figure out what's going on with this issue. I'd like to ask both of you if you can tell me, based on your organization's research, have you been looking at these geographic disparities where a state of Utah is 1 in 47 instead? And can you offer me any information that helps me understand why my state has a different number from the national average?
Well, I would go back to some of the comments I made earlier, in that differences in how states identify and serve children. Since our program, our tracking program, utilizes those sources, those record sources to identify children, and that varies from state to state. And that those numbers in many ways are a reflection of that. Some of our states don't have access to education records, and since we are dealing with 8-year-old children or school-age children, and they're served through IDEA and special education, that makes a difference as well.
Can you tell me, though, I appreciate there may be differences in methodology for collecting, but is my state better at it? Is that what you're telling me? Or is there something else going on in my state? Has there been any conclusion to these studies that talk about how things are done differently in different states?
So we are looking at both differences in how children are identified, right, as well as differences in risk factors across states to try to get a better sense of that.
Is there a target date when there may be a result? You say you're looking at it now. Do we know when there may be some answers?
Well, there are some answers. So from the report that we put out in 2008, what we could see is that children who were coming into the system were more likely to have a community diagnosis, so their community physicians are more likely to be aware of autism and coming into the system. And that's changed over the 10 years that we've been monitoring.
But I understand that there are differences. I'm trying to figure out, have you validated that that's what's going on, whether there's a 1 in 47 rate in Utah? I'm just trying to figure out why the number is different in my state.
One other example is that we are actually doing, we're not doing, Autism Speaks is funding a special study in South Carolina. So using one of the ATOM sites, they're looking at it in a much more in-depth way to see, in fact, is that number in South Carolina low? So again, it's a puzzle, and we're putting all the pieces of the puzzle together that way.
Yeah, look, I'm not a statistician. I just see a big difference in numbers. So I think it'd be helpful if we could understand why that number's different. In my limited time, I'd like to ask one other question. Can any of you tell me about any new therapy approaches that are emerging for effectiveness in treating autism?
There's certainly some therapies in terms of behavioral interventions and other kinds of things that are emerging, that are being developed. In terms of something like a medical therapy, I think we're much farther away from those kinds of interventions, though one would hope that eventually we would have those to offer as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.